So the new camera that a lot of enthusiasts have been whispering about is the Sony A7V. And calling it my dream camera come true might actually be an understatement. I've tested dozens of cameras in my life, from compact travel shooters to bulky cinema rigs. But the moment I held the Sony A7V in my hands, something clicked. Like that weird feeling you get when a piece of technology matches your imagination more than reality ever has. But not everything is perfect, and yes, there is one fatal flaw. The one thing Sony seems allergic to adding. And I promise I'll tear into that soon, but before doing that, I really want to take you through the journey, the practical experience, the unfiltered thoughts, the real testing. Because sitting behind a desk rattling off specs like some corporate brochure would be a crime against a camera this good. So, instead, I did what any person obsessed with visual storytelling would do. Hopped on a road trip across the Australia to push the Sony A7V beyond controlled environments. To places I've explored for years where the lighting, weather, motion, and unpredictability would expose any weakness instantly. And before you ask, no, I'm not paid by the brand. I'm not a Sony ambassador. I don't get to keep the camera. Even though deep down I believe the Sony gods should descend and gift it to me permanently for the love I show their products. But yeah, this review was done with my own sweat, my own travel costs, and frankly just for fun, for passion. Because when you genuinely love cameras, testing them in the wild isn't work, it's breathing. So, if that kind of vibe works for you, please subscribe to keep this storytelling tech train rolling. Now, our journey kicked off in the city, and not just any time, but late at night. When streetlights flicker like fireflies struggling against darkness. When buildings glow like digital candles, when a camera's sensor either shines or dies. At this hour, the Sony A7V was about to be baptized in shadows. I had earlier assumed that the second base ISO would be somewhere around 3200, similar to its older siblings from the Sony Alpha 7 series, like the Sony FX3 or even the trusty old champ, the Sony A74. But once I actually tested it at home before traveling, I nearly choked on my chai. Because the real second base ISO turned out to be 8000, which is wild by any metric. And for those who don't speak ISO, let me translate that to human emotions. The low light performance is unreasonably clean, absurdly capable. Almost criminally good for a camera that is not classified as a full cinema rig. You might see some clips now that fluctuate in ISO. Some at 6400, others at 10,000. A few accidental jumps to 12,800 because yes, I screwed up settings more than once while panicking in the dark. But that's the beauty of field testing, right? You get to see reality, not perfection. And even in those mistakes, the Sony A7V produced frames that looked clean, usable, cinematic, almost indistinguishable from cameras twice its price. When compared to the Sony FX3 at 12,800 ISO, the Sony A7V might be a hair noisier, like a tiny grain of sand that you can only spot if you're zoomed at 400%. While sniffing pixels like you're auditing CCTV footage, but otherwise, the performance is on par with Sony's old king of low light, which is insane. And that pushed me into confidence mode. I knew the camera could handle dark city frames, but could it handle uncontrolled motion? Could it handle hiking, sprinting, hand tremors, adrenaline filming? That thought sent me to the mountains. So, I packed my bag and drove toward the mountains. A place where handheld run-and-gun filmmaking is not a technique but a survival tactic. But of course, the weather had other plans. The sky looked like it wanted to file a lawsuit against sunshine. It rained, and rained again, and at some point, it started feeling like the camera and I were shooting a sequel to a film called 50 Shades of Rain. But now starring a censor and a shaky YouTuber trying to find a waterfall for a dramatic B-roll. Because nothing tests weather sealing and autofocus like rain that's angrier than your ex-toxic friend. The Sony A7V felt shockingly comfortable in rain. Buttons still clicky, grip still solid, ports still safe, ergonomics still forgiving. And yeah, the autofocus somehow even improved in those conditions. instantly locking on subjects even when I intentionally turned away like a dramatic film protagonist trying to pretend he's done with emotions. But nope, the sensor kept tracking. And not only humans, but animals, koalas on trees, dogs in walking paths, random birds sitting on signboards like they're auditioning for Disney. Even leeches that were lurking under wet leaves like nature's own tiny vampires trying to suck our blood. Yeah, they were there, crawling, watching, waiting. But the camera never hesitated, which tells me Sony has genuinely pulled autofocus features from the upper-tier cameras like those seen in the Sony flagship cameras. Likely algorithms influenced by tracking mechanics found in cameras like the legendary Sony A1 or the Sony A9 models, though not explicitly confirmed. But whatever the case, the tracking was brutally good in practice. And let's talk about IBPs, because Sony apparently includes 7.5 stops of it in the Sony A7V, which sounds like something a marketing team writes after consuming 10 cups of coffee and a legally questionable energy drink. But from my testing, while stabilization is genuinely improved over its predecessors, I wouldn't necessarily crown it the king of sensor stabilization. Because Panasonic's IBIS from the Lumix line is still another animal altogether. But Sony at least has fixed the reputation of its IBIS quirks. Cameras from the Lumix series wobble like a washing machine in spin cycle when shooting wide-angle lenses if IBIS and lens stabilization are not aligned properly. But Sony has historically avoided IBIS wobbles even while using wide-angle glass like the Sigma 16mm or the Tamron 17 to 28mm lenses. This is very underrated and often not talked about, which is wild because stabilization shouldn't just be about how steady a clip looks, but how natural it feels when motion exists. And the Sony A7V maintained natural motion without artificial distortions, which matters a lot when shooting cinematic handheld clips. Now onto resolution and cropping. The Sony A7V can finally shoot 4K 60 FPS uncropped, and 4K 120 with an APS-C crop. This isn't necessarily surprising in today's camera world where brands like Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, and even action cams have started pushing high frame rates with minimal compromises. But it is refreshing to see Sony adopt this without crippling the full-frame mode. What actually matters more is rolling shutter performance because dynamic pixels don't mean anything if jello motion exists. I tested this personally by panning trees quickly, whip-turning while walking, filming passing cars like I'm capturing a chase scene, and yeah. The rolling shutter speed was fully usable in 4060 uncropped. No jello wobble that breaks immersion. Sony even added a crop mode that prioritizes sensor readout speed for users who want faster readout performance, though naturally it narrows your field of view. Again, not groundbreaking, but practical, usable, and thoughtful. So anyway, after stumbling through rain, hiking up muddy slopes, avoiding leeches like I'm starring in a survival documentary, we finally locate the waterfall we assumed would deliver a cinematic climax. But it trickled like disappointment dripping through a leaking tap. Beautiful location, sad performance from nature. But the Sony A7V did deliver accurate exposure. Great dynamic range and punchy AF in those conditions, and honestly the landscape footage came out looking ridiculous. And this is where we witnessed the flaw that pains me personally because despite all these upgrades, Sony refuses to add open gate recording. No 3:2 or 4:3 sensor capture mode that Nikon and Panasonic have been adopting lately for better reframing flexibility. Literally every competitor has started adopting this to some degree, including the Nikon Z6 III, Panasonic GH6, Panasonic S5 IIX, and even DJI's action cam attempts like the Action 6. But Sony seems philosophically against it. The Sony A7V still only records 16:9 video. No footage flexibility for vertical cropping or anamorphic reframing without sacrificing half your pixels. You'll probably see Sony roasted online for this because to add dual sensors, better autofocus, extra ports, bigger battery, lighter body, 3.3 MP photography at 30 FPS electronic shutter, improved audio yet refuse open gate mode in 2025. That is wild corporate stubbornness. But aside from this, the 33MP sensor itself is a joy. 30 frames per second photography burst mode using electronic shutter is criminal. If you want to capture fast-moving subjects like sports, birds, cars, or unpredictable action, this thing delivers frames like machine gun photography. But yes, the mechanical shutter is still limited around 10 FPS, which is normal for Sony's mid-range cameras. Not terrible, but not champion level. But here's the deal, Sony finally added animal autofocus, pre-capture frame buffer, AF refinements inherited or inspired by the higher-tier Sony lineup like the A12's AF algorithm improvements. And taking photos on this camera, even for someone like me who spends 80% of his time on video, turned into a straight-up joyride.